plan to continue my practice this evening of what I've been doing this year, which is to draw from the texts that we're reading in the Bible reading schedule that was distributed at the beginning of the year. We're in week 22, and on Thursday of last week, we started the Book of Proverbs, and we started the first chapter of the Book of Proverbs. Proverbs is an extremely rich study. It is worth the time to read. It's worth the time to dig into and to think about and meditate upon. And hopefully, by talking about the introduction to this book, it will encourage and whet the appetite for us to really give careful consideration to these things. It opens up the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. There's a couple of words that we want to define as we come to them, and this is one of those words. The word proverb is a word that generally we define as being a pithy maxim, which just simply means a compact truth. In truth, it's usually metaphorical in nature, and it plays a role of a compare, contrast kind of a thing, and it's also a synonym to the word parable. Now, we generally reserve that word parable for the things that later come in the New Testament from the work of Jesus, the stories that he tells. Parables we usually look at as being longer than a quatrain, a couplet or so. But that's the only difference between a proverb and a parable. It's important to recognize that these things very often are signifying something different than what they're literally discussing. And so we want to keep that in mind. To know wisdom and instruction, he sets out his purpose for writing. To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, equity. To give prudence to the naive. Those are the next two words we want to spend a little time talking about. Prudence is simply a word that means discretion, our judgment, our foresight, the ability to look at something and make a judgment or exercise discretion, make a decision based upon these things. The purpose is to give an individual prudence who is naive. Now, that word we tend to use as a diminutive today, as something that's negative. When we call someone naive, we're not saying something nice about them or even something neutral about them. We're suggesting something bad about them. But all that word means is that someone lacks judgment because of a lack of experience or a lack of information. It is simply not understanding. It's very different from foolishness, because foolishness is when someone chooses to reject truth or when someone chooses to do something contrary to what they know is the right thing to do. This is someone who just lacks the ability to exercise that discernment. And so he's saying that the purpose of this book is to give prudence to those who lack the experience or insight to make good choices in life. To the youth, he says, knowledge and discretion. Again, the same kind of thing. It's a parallel here. Knowledge, information, or understanding, or enlightenment, having that information that you need in order to exercise discretion or to make choices. Everything in life involves discretion. We make choices about things. We make choices about how to handle things that we are faced with. We make choices about what is good or what is not good. We make choices about what we want to do or what we don't want to do. We have to exercise discretion in that, and the only way that it's going to be a good thing is if we exercise good discretion, if it's trained, if we have a sense of what is right and what is good. And I'm going to ask you to run to the back and just pull the gain back a little bit on one of these mics because they're feeding off each other. To understand a proverb, he says in verse 6, and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. And so he set forth at the very outset the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book is to move us from that class of being inexperienced, unknowledgeable, and inequipped to make good decisions, and move us into the category that we have discretion and judgment and foresight to make good decisions. And then verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. That's where it all starts. The instruction has begun. You want to know where it begins? Respect God. If you want to know where discretion begins, that's where it starts, with respecting God. If you want to know where prudence begins, that's where it starts, with respecting God and what He has said. If you want to know how to have good judgment and make good choices, start off by respecting the things that God has said. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And I made reference to that just a moment ago. The difference between naivete and foolishness is that in one case you don't know any different or any better, and in the other case you have chosen to despise the wisdom of God. You have chosen to reject His instruction. You have chosen not to listen to Him. Eve did something foolish in the garden. Eve was not naive. We do something foolish each time we choose to do evil over good. So he goes on in verse 8, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they're a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. And that word hear that's used there is rather simple. It's hear the way that your mother used to yell, did you hear me? After she had given you an instruction. Are you listening to me? Are you ready to do what I told you to do? Are you hearing what I'm saying to you? Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Now, he's not talking about our fathers and mothers at all. He's using that as an example. He's using something that we're familiar with and that we understand, the obligation to listen to our fathers and mothers to talk to us about listening to God. Having the good sense to fear and respect God, to listen to Him, to obey Him. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. I'm reminded when I read that verse of Peter's discussion of women and their adornment not to be merely external, not to be the braiding of hair, not to be the costly garments, not to be the jewelry in which they wear, not to be merely external, but rather let it be the quiet and hidden character of the heart, he said. What the proverb writer is suggesting here is that the ornaments that we wear about us, the great jewelries that we wear, the crowns for our head, are not some kind of physical thing. No, they're the instructions of God. They're living out and following the instructions that come from our spiritual Father. If sinners entice you, he goes on to say. Now, there's something worth talking about right there as well. In fact, we could probably spend the whole time talking about this one principle, because for far too many of us, we suggest, especially to the young people, that sin is horrible, that it's no fun, that you want to stay away from it, that it looks fun maybe, but when you get into it, you're going to be miserable. Listen to what he says. If sinners entice you, do not consent. Listen, sin is enticing. And it's easy to be enticed by it, and it's easy to enjoy it, and it's easy to stay there. And that's what God's telling us, and that's what we ought to be telling other people. I know it's easy. I know it's shiny, and it's pretty, and I know it's attractive, and I know it appeals to your flesh, and I know it satisfies certain desires, and I know that it has all of those things, but be careful. When they entice you, don't consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause, let us swallow them alive like Sheol. Sheol is the grave. Even whole as those who go down to the pit, we shall find all kinds of precious wealth. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us. We shall have one purse. This is the enticement of the sinner. Throw in your lot with me. Do what I'm doing. We will profit from this. We'll share in these profits. We'll enjoy this greatly. He is using a band of thieves, a band of robbers, a band of murderers as an illustration. It's true. You get out in this world very often. And anybody that studied, for instance, urban situations with young people coming up, that it's much, much safer in the gangs than it is not in the gangs. That the chances of you being protected and not being beaten up by people are much better if you have the protection of the gang. And if you're the one that are preying on people, you're preying on the weak and you're the strong rather than you being the weak out there being preyed upon. That's the enticement that's being suggested here, that you become a part of this band of people who go out and who attack, who swallow up people like the grave, who jump on them before you can be hurt, and who acquire precious wealth. He's saying, don't buy into it. That kind of life. And again, don't think of this literally, although literally it would be true. Think of this as any sin. As any lifestyle choice that draws you away from what is righteous, that draws you away from what is good, that promises some kind of safety, some kind of contentment, some kind of happiness, that promises to make you wealth in some ways, you know, the enticement to cheat, the enticement to lie at work, the enticement to cut corners. Everybody's doing it. Come on, come with us. He says, don't do it. Don't listen when they say, come with us. Don't consent. Listen to what he says, my son, do not walk in the way with them, verse 15. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the net in the eyes of any bird. That's an interesting verse, because it pulls from the realization that even animals, if you set traps for them right before them, are smart enough not to step into the trap. And what the writer is suggesting is that now we know the trap is being set. We know what the enticement is. We know that there are sinners out there trying to get us to go in and participate with them, and that we should not consent, and we don't need to be foolish. We need to at least be as bright as animals now that we know that the trap is being laid, and not fall into it. They lie in wait for their own blood, he says. Now that's what's going to happen in the end with any of these sinful lifestyles, with any of these things that men pursue. They lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. They're not really ambushing other people. They're not the strong and other people the weak, and they're not the advantaged and the benefited, though they may think it for a while. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors. You can be sure your sin will find you out. That's the way God puts it in another place. It's going to come home. You're going to face judgment. There will be a price. You are not bettering your position. You are not increasing your advantage. You are not providing for yourself. You are providing for your destruction. There is a way which seems right to man, and the end is destruction. You're providing for your destruction. He says that's what they're doing. They may not even realize it, because they may actually be the naive. But we don't have to be that way anymore. He's given us warning. He has told us that this begins with fearing God, listening to what God has said, and then he starts off saying, don't be enticed when other people say, come, go with us and do what we're doing. Listen to God. Follow in his path. Because they lie in wait for themselves. They ambush themselves. They take away their own life, not someone else's. Wisdom, he says, shouts in the street. This is a personification of wisdom. Obviously, wisdom is not a person. Obviously, wisdom is not out in the street. Obviously, wisdom is not shouting. But wisdom is there. Wisdom is available. Wisdom is proliferating openly and publicly. Wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the gates of the city she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love simplicity? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. How long are you going to stay naive? We don't have to stay naive. We might start that way. In fact, everyone starts that way. And everyone is naive about something at some point, and many of us, in fact, most of us, are naive about something at any point in our life. There are things that I'm naive about. I have no knowledge. I have no discretion. I have no awareness of. And if I found myself in the middle of a situation, I would be caught off guard, not able to make a good decision because I would have no idea how to handle it. I'm naive about that. We don't have to be naive about life. We don't have to be naive about righteousness. We don't have to be naive about sin. Because God has set forth His wisdom into this world, and it is screaming to us to pay attention and to not stay naive. How long will you love simplicity? Scoffers, how long will you delight yourself in your scoffing? You know the guys that stand at the corner and that poke fun of wisdom, of righteousness, of good, that make fun of people? I'm reminded of a passage in the Old Testament, an Old Testament prophet writing about the children of Israel, I think it is. Maybe Judah, but I think it's Israel. About how they forgot how to blush. And what he means by that is they're so callous and they're so embroiled in sin that they have no sense of shame anymore. Nothing embarrasses them. They forgot how to blush. And in our lifetime, if people blush about something, if people react to a situation or to something that someone says or to a joke that someone offers at work and they blush, oh, look, he's blushing. They make fun of someone having a sense of shame about them, of someone having a sense of propriety about what is right and what is good and what ought to be lifted up and what is shameful and what ought to not be made public. How long will you delight yourselves in your scoffing? If you listen to wisdom, you don't do that. How long will fools hate knowledge? Some people just refuse to learn. Wisdom is shouting at them. Standing in the middle of the street, shouting. They stop their ears. They refuse to hear. He says, turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you because I called you and you refused. I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention, and you neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. I'll even laugh at your calamity. I'll mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm and your calamity comes on like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come on you. He calls us to turn and to listen. Notice that the wisdom that comes from God is characterized here as reproof, as corrective in nature, as chastisement. Turn to my reproof, and I'll pour out my spirit upon you. I'll make known my words to you. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. But, he says, because I called and you refused. That's our other option, to refuse, to not listen, to not believe. Because I called and you refused, I stretched out my hand. See, he made the effort. He stretched out his hand, and no one paid attention, and you neglected my counsel, and you did not want my reproof. I will even laugh at your calamity. Everyone likes to talk about the mercy of God. Everyone likes to talk about the grace of God. Everyone likes to talk about the fact that God is a forgiving and loving God. But what wisdom says to us here at the very beginning of the book of Proverbs is God's reproof had better be heeded, because if it's not at the judgment, you will not meet a merciful God. You will not meet a gracious God. You will not meet a loving God. You'll meet a God who laughs at the calamity that comes upon you because you had the opportunity and you refused. I will even laugh at your calamity. I'll mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm and your calamity comes on like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come on you, there's a lot of people in this world who, for instance, when local governments set speed limits, drive above the speed limit. And if you ask them about it, they'll say, they're not going to stop me. They don't believe they're actually ever going to get in trouble for it. Same things happen in workplaces. Workplaces set forth rules and say you got to do this and you don't do that, and breaks should only be this long. And people ignore the rules because the boss isn't actually going to do anything about it. And some people look at their parents that way, because their parents threaten to do things and then they never go through with them. The judgment doesn't come. And so finally the kids go, well, they're not actually going to do anything. I'm not worried about it. You know what he's saying here? He's saying you're going to find out when you get to the end and your judgment comes upon you that God is one who is actually going to go through with his judgment. And you're not going to meet a God who says, oh, well, I understand. And so I'm not going to judge you like I said I would. You're going to meet a God who laughs at your calamity, who mocks at you for not listening. When distress and anguish come upon you. And notice what he says in verse 38. Then they will call upon me. You see, judgment's here. I'm reaping the fruit of the seeds in which I sowed. And now all of a sudden, I want to listen. Now all of a sudden, I want mercy. Now all of a sudden, I want forgiveness. Now all of a sudden, it reminds me of the parable of the 10 virgins. The 5 who were not prepared, and the bridegroom came. And they had to go back into town, and they had to buy the oil that they didn't have, and they had to buy their wicks, and they had to get their lamps ready, and they had to get prepared. And then they went back, and the door was shut and locked, and they knocked and said, let us in. And he said, no. That's what this is a picture of. Then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they shall not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. There's a day coming where it is going to be too late. It is going to be too late to listen. It is going to be too late to learn. It is going to be too late to become wise. It is going to be too late to become prudent. It is going to be too late to get discretion. When discretion comes after that, it's too late. Got a lesson one time I preached. It was called 2 Confessions of the Christ. In that lesson, I make the point that every single person that is ever born into this world will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Every single one of us is going to make that confession. It's either going to be by choice in life, because I listen and I believe and I respond and I say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he is my master and my Lord, and I will follow him. Or it's going to be after my life is over, when I'm facing judgment, and in fear and in terror every knee bows before him, and every tongue confesses that he is Lord. Only problem is that second one doesn't do anybody any good. They'll call on me, but I will not answer. They'll seek me diligently, but they shall not find me, because they hated knowledge, and they chose not the fear of the Lord. Remember back in verse 7? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. They chose to reject the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat of the fruit of their own way, be satiated with their own devices, for the waywardness of the naive shall kill them, and the complacency of fools shall destroy them. But he who listens to me shall live securely, and shall be at ease from the dread of evil. Proverbs chapter 1 is about the decision that every one of us faces in life. About the decision whether or not we're going to listen to the wisdom of God, whether or not we're going to listen to his knowledge, whether or not we're going to conform and follow, whether or not we will hear him. And the outcome of that choice. If we will listen, if we will heed, if we will be transformed from being naive to being discerning, from being foolish to being wise, we have no fear in the Lord's return. We'll look forward longingly to his return. That's why Paul realized that to live was Christ, but to die was gain. He wasn't afraid of death. He wasn't afraid of judgment. He wasn't afraid of being with the Lord. He knew it was going to be a good meeting. The choice we make when we decide to reject the fear of God. When we decide to reject his counsel, when we decide to go our own path, when we decide to pursue our own ways, we're going to eat the fruit of the field in which we plant. We're going to gain the reward of our own behavior, and we're going to stand under account for all that we have done. Each man will give an account of himself to God for the deeds which are done in the body. God forbid me having to give an account of myself for the foolish things that I have done. I'm grateful. I'm grateful that wisdom stands in the street and tells me about God, and tells me about his Christ, and tells me about his sacrifice, and tells me about the hope that I have because of the blood that was shed for me. I'm glad that there is a covenant that can put me in a relationship with God where I am forgiven, where my sins are removed from me as far as the east is from the west, where I don't have to fear his judgment, where I don't meet a God that mocks at my calamity, that laughs at my dread, that says, you did this to yourself because you refused me and you refused to listen. Point of the book of Proverbs is to make certain that we are not the ones that refuse, and to provide us with everything so that we become knowledgeable, and we become wise, and we become discerning, and we make good choices in life that put us in fellowship with God so that we receive his rewards and his love and his mercy and his care.